Oh, hello. Just caught me reading something very important. But it's good you're here so we can crack on with today's business, which is having a read through one of Thomas Wyatt's most famous poems, Whoso List to Hunt. So pull up a chair, grab yourself a beer, and we'll get started. That's right, welcome to the read through. So as always, after I've said a couple of very brief things about context, we'll read the poem together. First we'll clear up a few obvious difficulties that might be caused by the remoteness of the language and so on. And then we'll get into the poem, get a real feeling for it, have a little snuggle up to it, and hopefully get a real appreciation of its power. Okay, so first let's just very quickly and very briefly know a couple of things about Wyatt himself that are relevant to the poem before we get down to it. And there he is, very handsome lad. So I'm just going to draw our attention to two things here. There are lots of other context, but we haven't got all day. So I'm just going to think about a couple to get us started. So the first thing to think about is the love poem. So this is a poem that I teach right at the beginning of a course I run on the love poem, and it's right at the beginning of that course because Wyatt, writing at the beginning of the 16th century, is really right at the beginning of the English love poem. So Wyatt is one of the first English lyric poets. In other words, one of the first people to write short, expressive poems in English. And, you know, it's a nice idea to think of the English poem as being born with love, as beginning with love. But we shouldn't forget that Wyatt's love poems are often also about hate, before we get too romantic about it. And it is really his ability to express conflicting emotional states vividly that makes Wyatt so brilliant and modern. And then more particularly, within the history of the love poem, Wyatt was responsible for introducing the great European poet of the medieval period, the Italian Petrarch, introducing him into the English language, and this brought with it the conventions of the love lyric in general and of the sonnet in particular. And Whoso List to Hunt as a poem is loosely based on a Petrarch sonnet known as Canzoniere 190. We wouldn't call Wyatt's poem a translation, but it does leap off from Petrarch's poem, even though it's in a voice all Wyatt's own, as we'll hopefully see. And the poem's there if you want to pause and have a quick comparison of the two. And then the second context, which is related to the first, is really politics. So we need to think about Wyatt as a courtier of Henry VIII. And there's a few reasons we might need to think about this. Firstly, it was partly because of Wyatt's role as an ambassador in England and France that he got so familiar with continental literary forms like the sonnet. So that's quite a simple background there. Secondly, the cult of courtly love is one context of Wyatt's poetry. So courtly love is this kind of late medieval, early modern game in which romance is it's really played out in language because it can't be enacted in fact. So it's a very proper form of romance. So courtly love performances are generally unconsummated and the lover is unavailable by definition. And then finally, there's the more immediate historical context that this poem is famous for, because finally Wyatt was a courtier rumoured to have been intimate with Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, and this poem, among others of Wyatt's, is thought to be about that for reasons that will hopefully become obvious. So the poem can be read as a kind of very public political poem, as well as a love poem that we might think of as private. Okay, so that is enough about all that. So we'll get down to the poem now. I'm just going to read it out and then we'll go through it together, dive in and start to really get intimate with it. So, Whoso list to hunt? Whoso list to hunt, I know where is an hind, but as for me, alas, I may no more. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore, I am of them that farthest comest behind. Yet may I by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer, but as she fleeth afore, fainting I follow. I leave off therefore, since in a net I seek to hold the wind. Who list her hunt, I put him out of doubt, as well as I may spend his time in vain. And graven with diamonds in letters plain, there is written her fair neck round about. Nole me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame. Oof, what a poem. Okay, so what we'll do first of all is just get out of the way a few very obvious obscurities in the poem that are just easily translated and will clear things up significantly. So I've just underlined a few things here that are going to help us out. So, whoso lists to hunt. Whoso really meaning there whoever, list to meaning looks for, seeks to hunt. So whoever wants to hunt, whoever's looking to hunt. And hind being a female deer. Alas, I may no more. Alas, obviously an old term for, unfortunately, an exclamation for that. I may no more, literally meaning there I can't anymore. Vain travail. Vain there meaning fruitless or useless, rather than the modern meaning of the word. Travail is work, as in travailler, the French, to work. Fleeth afore simply flees before or runs away. Graven with diamonds, literally there engraved, but probably more generally simply decorated. And then we have this Latin phrase, nole me tangere, which translates as do not touch me, and it's Christ's words to Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of John. We'll think about what that means a bit more in a moment. We all know who Caesar is, but really here roughly standing in for king. And then one final thing we might want to consider is the rhyme scheme. We don't need to get bogged down, and this is quite boring, but there's one thing that we must recognise, which is that the rhyme scheme tells us that the poem is divided into two parts, and when you read it out, you are sort of subconsciously registering this division into two parts. And the two parts are, we have an octet of 8 lines and a sestet of 6 lines, and conventionally, these are really conventions from Petrarch. Conventionally, the octet would be where the problem or the initial argument is laid out, and then the sestet would be where a solution is found or where some sort of closure is achieved. And as you probably know, sonnets, lots of sonnets, end in rhyming couplets, which are conventionally supposed to bring special closure, because if it neatly ends on a rhyming couplet, it sounds very closed. And obviously Shakespeare ends a lot of his scenes with rhyming couplets for that reason. Though, and one reason for mentioning that is that we might want to consider whether that really is a rhyming couplet that ends this poem. Okay, so that's a quick sort out of some of the things that might be a obvious barrier to us reading the poem. But we've kind of sorted that out now, so we will now proceed to really get into the poem. Okay, so let's get down to the poem. So we'll take it to begin with sentence by sentence, as it's nicely structured in that way. And we'll just see what it says to us, or at least what it says to me. You may have other things. This is not going to be an exhaustive reading, but this is just some of the things that I think we might say about the poem. Okay. Whoso lists to hunt, I know where is an hind, but as for me, alas, I may no more. So we've talked about this whoso, that's roughly meaning whoever, so we've got immediately in the very first word the address of the poem. And if we're thinking about what that address is in terms of that line, whoso lists to hunt, I know where is an hind, it is, in a way, intimating there's some sort of secret being imparted here. And when you read that line, whoso lists to hunt, I know where is an hind, it is actually quite whispery. So there might be something a little bit conspiratorial, at least in that very first line. And connected to that, there's also something quite excitable, quite excited about the line. So it's very fast. Whoso lists to hunt, I know where is an hind. And we can think about the reasons why it's fast. To begin with, it has a lot of unstressed syllables. So really, the two main stressed syllables, which are the two big words in that line, have a very clear stress. So we just rush through the other ones, and it gives it quite a fast, kind of sprightly flow. And if we want to think about these words, obviously the hunt we'll have to consider that throughout the poem. That's the central metaphor of it. But we've got this nice alliteration here with hind, which just gives the whole line quite a nice catchiness. So we're set up for something there. It's excitable, there's a secrecy to it, and there is a speed about it. Which makes this next line all the more remarkable because it is very different, and you quite often have these very clashing registers in Wyatt, which, at the time was something he was thought of as terribly inelegant in some ways, but that's kind of what we value about him now. Because if we look at this line, but as for me, alas, I may no more, that line is slow. And it's slow for some quite obvious reasons. We've got a lot of M's. They're very hard to read quickly. They make it for quite a stumbling rhythm. But as for me, alas, I may no more. It's very hard to say those final three words, for example, quickly. So it just creates quite a hobbled, even quite an awkward pace. And the nature of these M's is in direct contrast to the consonant sounds we've got up here. We've got H's and W's, which are very easy to say very quickly, very breathy consonants. So this is slow, and there's a couple of things, we're not just pointing that out for the sake of it. There's a couple of reasons we might notice that, especially when we go back to reread it. First of all, the poem is interested in slowness. Wyatt is behind. He's too slow to keep up with the deer. And in terms of tone, what that slowness, particularly in relation to its preceding line, gives us is some sort of dejection. So if we read these two lines back, you can kind of hear that a little bit, even in this first few words. Whoso lists to hunt, I know where is an hind. As for me, alas, I may no more. Okay, so Wyatt knows about a deer. He has told us he knows where it is. And he's told us that it's not really suited to him anymore. And there's a kind of sadness being implied there. And in the next few lines, Wyatt unfolds a little bit about why he may no more. So let's have a look. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore, I am of them that farthest cometh behind. So we've had vain travail, so we've seen what that means, roughly kind of useless work. But we might think about a double meaning in that word vain. So we do have the kind of literal term and the way that Wyatt means it, which is to say, unfruitful, etc. But we might also think about the word vanity there, and a kind of, even a sort of narcissistic desire at work. Hath wearied me so sore. We'll come back to this word weary, but we do start to get these alliterative pairings which go on to structure the poem in so sore. And again, we've got this quite stumbling prosody here. Farthest cometh behind, these sort of two-syllable words. Again, which is sort of suggestive of a slowness. So if we wanted to kind of summarise at this point, we've had obviously Wyatt telling us about the deer, telling us that he's too slow, possibly too old, is sort of implicit as well. And then we have some sort of reasons, which is that he has been wearied. Not just wearied though, there is an element of pain in that weariness, soreness. I am of them that farthest cometh behind. So I am if we want to say one of them, the farthest cometh behind. So he is at the back of the chasing pack. That's where the metaphor has got us to at this point. So there's an idea that there's a load of hunters here, and a weary, sore Wyatt is chasing from the back. Okay, so let's look at the next sentence. Yet may I by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer, but as she fleeth afore, fainting I follow. I leave off therefore, since in a net I seek to hold the wind. So if we think about this, we've got, first thing we may notice is we've got this word may, and we've already had this word up here, and this poem is really structured by these pairings of words that on a first reading might seem, again, quite awkward or inelegant of a poem, particularly a sonnet. To reuse these words in this way might seem a little bit poorly done, but in this case it really is doing something. So we have, what the word may is doing here is really quite obvious. We have up here Wyatt saying, I may no more. Very clear sentiment there. And then we have here, yet may I by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer. So he may no more, and yet he may not actually withdraw. So we've got some sort of what we might loosely call conflict. In fact, we've got direct contradiction in the poem, and we get that a few more times. And we might also want to think about this word may, which again we might think of as having a double meaning. So really, Wyatt up here and here, he's really meaning he can't anymore. He's sort of unable to, his body won't allow him, as it were. But we've also, in the poem, we do have this use of, or this invocation of permission, and that word may is kind of at work, that meaning of the word may is at work there as well. So yet may I by no means my wearied mind, and we've got weary again repeated, which seems, for a poet to repeat that word seems like they don't have a big vocabulary, but of course the weariness, it seems, is in fact doubled. It seems like a weary thing to do, to use that word weary twice. And there's this kind of implication that Wyatt is not at the top of his powers here because he's been so worn out from this deer. And if we think about this phrase, draw from the deer, really that is probably meaning something like withdraw from the deer. But there's quite a kind of bodily figure there, which is to say, if you think about something like drawing blood, like drawing an arrow out of a wound or something like that, we've got quite a kind of visceral metaphor here of the mind almost being stuck in the deer, and Wyatt being he can't take his mind out, so his body is being dragged along. And then finally, the other thing we might say about this particular sentence is this very striking ending. As she fleeth afore, fainting I follow. So, it doesn't take much to work out. Got a lot of F's there. And it seems as though that kind of alliteration, or a particular kind of F alliteration, seems to me anyway to give a kind of flutteriness to it, which is sort of implicit in that fainting. And there is something here. Wyatt is often correctly as well read as a very hyper-masculine type of love poet, but we do have a kind of reversal of conventional gender roles in this poem. We have this, we have Wyatt fainting, we have him being bad at hunting, and so on. And I appreciate there are readings out there, particularly on YouTube, about this poem that says it's celebrating the thrill of the chase, etc. But it doesn't look to me like Wyatt is enjoying this very much, or that he's particularly good at it. And then if we just finally consider this, the shortest sentence in the poem, I leave off therefore, since in a net I seek to hold the wind. So it's interesting that Wyatt would leave off therefore halfway through the poem, because we already know that he's not really going to leave off, he's going to carry on talking about it. and we'll see how he does that in the next sentence. And this, therefore, is again trying to grab a bit of sort of clarity, a bit of argumentative vigor, as it were, to sort of feel sure of himself again. But again, we'll see whether that works in a moment. And then we have this metaphor, almost a cliche there. Since in a net I seek to hold the wind, so that's obviously you can't hold the wind in a net, or in much else for that matter, but in a net particularly because it's got loads of holes in it. So what's obviously being suggested there is that this hind, this woman, is kind of unpossessable. And then we go on to this penultimate sentence. Who list her hunt? I put him out of doubt, as well as I may spend his time in vain. So this is carrying on this kind of therefore. So I put him out of doubt. That's very definite, or at least it is aspiring to definition. But it's kind of undercut there by the fact that we have this phrase, I leave off therefore. I leave off therefore. Very boldly stated. But in fact, Wyatt does not leave off. In fact, he returns to the beginning of the poem. Whoso list a hunt, who list her hunt. So we have this kind of repetitive structure, and it's almost in the manner of an obsession or an addiction or something like that. So these two parts of this line seem to be in direct sort of contradiction to each other, in conflict, although we might say that there is some sort of dramatic irony going on here, because the speaker wants to say this, but in fact the poem is saying that there is an addictive, obsessive relationship at the root of this poem. Who lists a hunt, I put him out of doubt, as well as I may spend his time in vain. So that's roughly meaning, like me, he'll be wasting his time on this woman, this hind, literally. So the poem there is, again, returning to this idea that it's sort of giving advice, it's letting someone in on a secret. So in that sense, we have, again, a kind of an attempt at definition, resolution, at certainty, at closure even, where Wyatt is simply resigning. He's simply saying, well, this is the undoubted lesson of this. You might spend your time in vain like me. And that actually, if you ended the poem there, that might really seem like the end of the poem, and that would be, a perfectly workable poem. It would be perhaps quite it would be a significantly less interesting one. But there is more, and we have it in this word, and. Always very interested in that word, and why it's added there, because we have what seems to be a conclusion there, and then Wyatt can't help himself, he's got to go on. And then we have this idea, engraven with diamonds in letters plain, there is written her fair neck round about. So she's got a collar, really, we might say, in everyday terms. And again, Wyatt is, he's reaching for some kind of certainty here in letters plain. That seems very certain. It seems, it's almost like something is sort of being written in stone here. And he's scratching for certainty because there's so much contradiction up here. Engraven with diamonds in letters plain, there is written her fair neck round about, nole mi tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame. So we'll come on to why that line is so brilliant in a moment. But you can already see how things are actually not as plain as Wyatt would like to say. So for Caesar's I am, so this is the reason that this is often seen to be a poem about Anne Boleyn, because Caesar is supposed to be Henry VIII, etc. And we have this do not touch thing here. But in fact, and this seems to indicate some sort of domestication, some sort of like she's been controlled at this point. She's got a collar around her neck, and it says who owns her, which is Caesar / Henry VIII, if we want to believe that. But in fact, the final line is anything but controlled. She is in fact wild. She is not domesticated, even with the collar on. And this word, wild, is emphasised if we have a read back of that. Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame. So that's the only one with a really long vowel sound there, and it really stands out in that line. And the other thing we might note about this ending, and why it's such a striking ending, is because we're building up. I mean, it might not be clear these days, but we would, if we were a 16th century reader, we would be expecting this couplet to round it out and finish it off, and get to where we want to be, which we want the poem to end at rest. That's what a good sonnet is supposed to do. But this doesn't really end at rest. So we've got the kind of argumentative contradiction there, and then we've got the fact that these two words don't really rhyme. Although the poem does seem to have a kind of quite a devastating ending in some ways, it doesn't have that neatness that we might expect. And you can hear it when you read it. Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame. So it's almost as though this ending here has a sort of wildness, a sort of refusal to be ordered in the way that we might think a sonnet would need to be. So we've got to the end of the poem there, and what Wyatt wants to say, really, I mean, this is again supposed to be cautionary, I suppose, but it's cautionary in quite a contradictory way. And I think if we want to summarise the poem, it's actually a very difficult poem to summarise because it is in a lot of different places at once, and there's quite a lot of contradictory impulses. It has this impulse to kind of be definitive, to be ordered, to be almost masculine, and to get things straightened out and to get to the bottom of things. But we also have all these contradictions that the poet sort of doesn't seem to quite, or the speaker at least doesn't seem to quite be aware of. And that's one of the brilliant things about the poem. It is expressing that, that uncertainty, that kind of conflict that you might have, the ways in which love might be obsessive, the ways in which love might be even humiliating. We have that here. So I've got quite a lot of red ink here now. So what I'll do is we'll just get back to the poem as it actually exists without this rather unsightly mess all over it, and see what we might, from all the things that at least I've been reading into it, what it seems to me is actually at the bottom of the poem. Okay, so here we are back to the poem. And I'm just going to say three things by way of closing here. Firstly, I'm just going to think about what this is as a love poem. So, by any definition, this is a love poem, but we need to think about what it says about love. What kind of love does it express? And what kind of relation is being taken to the beloved? And, what does it even philosophically say about love? So clearly the poem expresses love as a hunt, which we might immediately think of as problematic, because the metaphor in general is objectifying and dehumanizing of women. And the poem certainly takes for granted the notion that love is some kind of hunt. But as I say, it would be wrong to say that this poem is about the thrill of the chase, because if Wyatt is thrilled here, I'd really hate to see him mopey. There is a hunt here, but Wyatt as a hunter is inadequate, he's outrun, he's humiliated, he's a terrible hunter. He has no hope, and yet he continues to pursue. He's completely out of control of himself. And there are various points where the metaphor is complicated. So halfway through we see Wyatt describing something much closer to being dragged along against his will, rather than showing off his virility by any kind of hunting activity. Wyatt is also fainting in what seems to be a conventional gender reversal. He's given up, but he can't give up. He wants, but he can't have. He's left holding nothing. So the poem speaks of love as something that divides a man against himself, and it undoubtedly is a man. Love is something that throws him into contradictions, into obsessions, into repetition, into confusion, as he becomes a kind of slave of desire in spite of himself. So we have something much closer to the hunter being the one at the mercy of his prey. And though we may not like the metaphor, we can say with some certainty that it's not being used in any conventional way, that is, to sort of straightforwardly assert male dominance. And then the second thing I want to ask is, how does the poem think? So as we've just been through it there, we can hear all the sudden shifts, the self-contradiction, the hesitancy, the repetitions. And as I say, back in the day, these were things that were generally thought of as terribly inelegant in Wyatt, things that made him sound very rough around the edges. But now we might think of Wyatt in this way as doing something really original and influential, because this roughness gets us a lot closer to expressing a mind in movement, which is a messy thing. So in other words, we can think of the form of the poem as showing us Wyatt thinking through the poem in the present tense. So we can think of the poem as showing the action of the mind at work. So Wyatt, in the unevenness of the poem and the inconsistencies of it, he gives us something in the nature of an internal monologue, of an internal life that is divided against itself. And he allows us to get very close to this. And he's one of the first people that allows us to get very close to this. And it will come to its sort of ultimate fruition, perhaps, in Shakespeare a few decades later. Now, we may think that people have always had internal lives, that they've always thought about themselves, that they've always articulated feelings in this way. But actually, this is quite a historically specific way of thinking of having a kind of interiority in that way. And Wyatt was one of the first poets in the language to start recording this interiority with any immediacy. So when we think about thinking, Wyatt is part of the history that informs us doing that. And thirdly and finally, I want to think about what the poem thinks. So, at a simple level, the poet thinks about his beloved who is unavailable to him. But why does it think this beloved is unavailable? And this is where the poem becomes quite complex but very brilliant. So on the one hand, the poem shows desire bumping into social boundaries. So the beloved is unavailable, in part, the speaker wants to say, because she belongs to the king, and there's a social order preventing the lover and other lovers from possessing this woman. But this is just what the speaker wants to say, because alongside this order there is something quite different, indeed something quite opposite, and that goes by the name really of the wild. So the beloved is unavailable here because she is wild, because she is like the wind, because she is too fast, she is ungraspable, she is untamed, she is unfathomable. And this is quite a different proposition, and people rarely point out how the final couplet there shows two things in opposition, order and wildness. All of which to say is that the beloved has power. Wyatt's impulse is initially to attribute it to the king, but this is just because he wants to put himself out of doubt, because the final word of the poem is that the power is a quality of the beloved herself. She is wild for to hold for everyone, including the king. So there you go. I've said my piece, and I'm going to end quite abruptly there. But that is my understanding, my reading, my enjoyment of Whoso, Lister Hunt. So if you've got any questions or any comments, then just leave them below, and I'll try my best to get back to you. But if not, have fun with the poem, enjoy it, it's a beautiful thing, and I'll see you next time.